pretty big time here in New York City, with the Knicks winning their first NBA championship in 53 years and removing a carbuncle from the soul of this city and giving millions of New Yorkers like me a reason to celebrate, find joy, and maybe a little bit of light rioting. Got me to think about an actual riot that took place inside Madison Square Garden. But not the one that currently stands on 33rd and 8th, where the greatest comeback in sports history took place, but the third iteration of the Garden, about 17 blocks uptown, between 49th and 50th Streets along 8th Avenue. The second longest running garden of the four that have existed on the west side of Manhattan was home to all but one of the Rangers' 4 Stanley Cups. God, that is a depressing stat. But it was also the site of some of the most turbulent times in the early days of modern pro wrestling because, as we've mentioned on this channel before, the promoters who occupied the building could run hot and cold not only with the audience, but with the building operators themselves. I'm Matt Ryan, and historically speaking, this is a historical short on the riot and the time where pro wrestling changed and Vince McMahon rose to power. 1 year before the riot took place inside the Garden, wrestling had ended an 11-month absence from the world's most famous arena, headlined by arguably the biggest star in the sport not to hold a world title at that time, Antonino Rocca, and a man who we've covered a fair amount on this channel, Dick Afflis, aka Dick the Bruiser, drawing 10,400 fans and a gate of $30,000, which in modern money would equate to $369,244.61. What brought wrestling and, more importantly, 10,000 humans, which outdrew any card inside MSG since 1954, was the burgeoning TV product produced by Washington, D.C. promoter Vince McMahon, who took over Turner's Arena in Washington, D.C., and soon would name it Capitol Arena. A real Lincoln Kennedy thing here, with McMahon helping develop and run Turner's Arena, which was just a retrofitted garage, and then less than 30 years later, his son... You get it. After Toots Mondt couldn't book cards to draw fans in despite a collection of top pro wrestling stars, Mondt's style had burned out all but 8,000 fans in 1955, leading to a canceled show in November of that year, leading the way for McMahon to come in and completely rework the way things looked and felt on the card. Wasn't all roses, sunshine, and sweet kisses, though, as veteran New York promoters and critics of the DC-based McMahon saw the Dumont Network replacing their wrestling program from the Dumont Telecenter in New York for McMahon's Championship Wrestling from Washington as a gift to the second-generation promoter. McMahon, unlike other promoters in most sports concerns, was unafraid to show not only his cards on television, but his biggest matches, his main events on the Capitol Arena cards, which in turn could serve as right promotional material for a rematch, a separate affair for a wrestler and their rival, or an advantageous spotlight for those coming to a town near you. While the arenas were where promotions and, more importantly, promoters made the most bank, giving the audience more reasons to see the matches was a cadence break that a renewed interest in seeing wrestling at Madison Square Garden. What also worked for McMahon was what would become the house style of the Capitol Wrestling Corporation, and then utilized by almost all of the top territories and even on professional wrestling cards to this day, more so in some promotions than the others, was variety, gimmicks, and a fully fleshed out card. He ingratiated his stars with not only various ethnic enclaves that existed in New York and DC, but presented something more than a repetition of wool trunk-wearing hyper-serious men. The next evolution of pro wrestling was happening under the watchful eye of McMahon, as each member of the card had a reason to be in the spot they were in. And the card had a shape and a sense of form, a rhythm that helped fans go home happy. McMahon still had to deal with the litany of nonsense politics and infighting that nearly killed pro wrestling in the city the last few decades, and has all but killed the wrestling in the city in 2026. But utilizing Mondt as the first ever talent relations / heat spot guy, something his son would reuse time and time and again with people like J.J. Dillon and Jim Ross, he built the pack with Newark-based promoter Willie Gilzenberg as well. McMahon was not only on the path to securing wrestling in the biggest market in the country, but growing his influence up and down the eastern seaboard. When you look at that 1956 Garden card compared to other cards from MSG in that era, you'll see a marked difference in personalities and presentation, utilizing what would now be considered micro or mini wrestlers like Lord Littlebrook and Little Beaver, two men who would still be on McMahon family cards up to 30 years after this, to a variety of eccentric sounding names such as Cowboy Lee, Skull Murphy, local sounding products like Miguel Perez, foreignish heels such as Mr. Moto and Hans Schmidt, along with name talent such as Rocca, Afflis, and Dick Steinborn. There was also a young Jackie Fargo who'd helped cultivate diverse yet hyper-focused cards as the top draw in Tennessee in the prevailing decades. While wrestling would return to the Garden in 1957, it would not be a monthly affair, as from May until September of that year, the Garden would be dark for wrestling, which could be attributed to a Graham, but not a wrestling Graham, as the Reverend Billy Graham was locked in for a 16-week revival inside MSG starting 2 days after a May 13th card headlined by Rocca and Miguel Perez defeating Dick the Bruiser and Carl Von Hess, and featuring the aforementioned Dr. Jerry Graham, who teamed with Roy Shire on the card. In the midst of all this going on in New York, the NWA, dealing with the investigation into very obvious obfuscation of the law and running basically a crime family, also realized that Lou Thesz needed a bit of a break from audiences on the North American continent and helped set up an angle where both he and George Carpentier would have a claim to their world title. Thesz, not a popular draw in New York, would travel to Hawaii and Australia, while Carpentier would find himself booked on New York cards through the summer thanks to the new booker of the NWA World title and their secretary, Jim Barnett. In September, he would make his MSG debut, but not as world champion. The NWA would run a Carpentier-Thesz rematch that would see a disqualification, the same situation that saw Carpentier stake his claim to the title, but in the aftermath, it would only get murkier and lead to Montreal promoter Eddie Quinn quitting the alliance and creating his own world title with blackjack and hookers. And while Thesz would be claiming the NWA World title back after a disqualification in a will they, won't they, he said situation, Quinn's AAC World title would be recognized mostly in Quinn's Boston territory up until 1969, despite a rare instance in the 1950s where it would be defended on a Capitol Wrestling card by then-champion Killer Kowalski. He comes up in our story quite a bit a little later on, but the world title situation is immaterial to our story, but goes to show the kind of carny chaos that was inhabiting the industry at this time, especially when you realize within all of it, McMahon's power base continued to grow through the Northeast as he codified his union with Gilzenberg, Mondt, and our old pal Johnny Doyle, who you may remember from our first series of videos, when they created the Capitol Wrestling Corporation. Carpentier's debut would not be an unheralded affair, though, as he and Antonino Rocca would square off in the main event of that September 16th card, drawing 19,165 humans into the Garden for a time-limit draw. His return to MSG in November, 17 days before the Riot, would see over 20,000 fans and a gate of $63,876.14, or in 2026 money, $778,413.22, as Carpentier and Killer Kowalski would go to a draw along with a semi-main event of Rocca and Miguel Perez, defeating the team of Dr. Jerry Graham and Roy Shire. With a second Garden show on the books for that month, McMahon looked to continue the momentum by pairing the proven drawing cards of Carpentier and Rocca against Killer Kowalski and Dick the Bruiser. While McMahon might be biting off more than he could chew trying to follow up a 20,000-person card with another big matchup, anything over 10,000 would be a killer cherry on the sundae for Capitol Wrestling Corporation, as for the first time in the decade, hell, since 1949, the year wrestling was allowed back in the Garden, there would be more than 6 cards in a year inside the world's most famous arena. Before that, you'd have to go back to 1936 to see more than 6 wrestling cards held inside the Garden, and 1935 had the most of that period, holding 10. That would move McMahon in rarefied air alongside legendary promoter Jack Curley and all but lock him and Capitol as the promoters of record inside the Garden. Want to learn more about the rocky history of wrestling in New York? You're in luck with our first series of episodes on the First National Wrestling Company and how we ended up here. You can find that link in the description. Or if you just, go to the channel and, hit the Historically Speaking bar, you know how to do that. You're an adult. What was helping shape all of this momentum was not only the promotion of McMahon and Capitol, the national television spotlight through the Dumont network, but the enduring connection that Rocca, an Argentinian by way of Italy, had with the burgeoning Puerto Rican population of New York, who were one of the most vocal and most consistent fans in the stands for matches not only at the Garden, but all around New York City. Rocca would become one of the first of many stars on the New York scene who would tap into and become the heartbeat of the different ethnic enclaves across the city in the Northeast. On the other side of that was the heat one could get from putting Rocca in any semblance of trouble or injustice, especially when you lived for the heat. And one man who certainly lived for heat was Dr. Jerry Graham. Now, Graham was not initially penciled in for this match, but with Killer Kowalski needing to pull out due to an injury, the good doctor would be tasked to join Dick the Bruiser in the Garden for his first main event in MSG. Jody Hamilton, who alongside his brother Larry were working in the territory at the time, had this to say about Graham in his autobiography available from ECW Press. My brother and I were in New York when Jerry Graham was on top. I went home for a couple of weeks after getting hurt. While I was at home, Jerry sent me a bouquet of flowers, which I thought was a nice gesture, because I wasn't anybody. I had seen Jerry playing the big shot in New York, getting incredibly drunk, even to the point where he couldn't work. He would stand in the middle of a group of Puerto Ricans and light his cigar with a $20 bill. When he threw the burning bill on the ground, they would dive for it, and he would laugh uproariously. Fucking yikes. Fucking yikes. So what happens when you have a man who enjoys taunting anybody, especially a specific ethnicity, facing off against a man who has become the accidental avatar for that ethnicity's hopes, dreams, and a sense of justice? Well, this is what happened. Wrestling ends in riot at Garden. 2 policemen hurt as fans storm ring and throw chairs and bottles. A riot broke out last night at Madison Square Garden immediately after the final exhibition on the professional wrestling program. 2 patrolmen were injured and the damage was considered heavy as spectators swarmed into the ring throwing bottles and chairs. The melee began after the tag team contest pitting Antonino Rocca of Argentina and Edouard Carpentier of France against Dr. Jerry Graham of Hollywood, California and Dick Afflis of Detroit. A tag team fight is one in which 2 fighters are allowed in the ring, but may call on his teammate by touching him. This is a substitution and the wrestler tagged replaces his partner. Fans seated near the ring began the riot. Most of them struggled to get at the losing team of Graham and Afflis, who were deemed the villains in this regularly scheduled contest. As often happens at wrestling shows, the wrestlers on the program do not stop fighting when the exhibition is over, particularly when the winners are crowd heroes. The villains then feign a desire for more battle. This was the apparent case last night, but it got out of hand. Graham and Rocca continued to fight until, as Rocca admitted later, they were angry. Rocca was already bleeding from blows he suffered in the scheduled bout. He then rammed Graham's head against one of the brass ring posts. Fans who favored Rocca were incensed by this time, and the mass climb into the ring began. The folding chairs on the floor at ringside were thrown and taken into the ring by those who got that far. 6 or 7 persons managed to reach the apron outside the ropes at the ring, and 3 climbed inside the ropes. All were forced back. However, many of the 12,987 fans who attended took part in the rioting by throwing chairs. One chair was dropped from the 3rd deck balcony, barely missing spectators trying to get out of the 50th Street exit. 33 policemen with the regular Garden detail of 30 special police had trouble in moving the crowd out of the arena. Struggling spectators caused more damage as they left, breaking the glass case for a fire hose and breaking more chairs near the 50th Street side. When the Garden was finally cleared, there appeared to be more than 200 chairs broken on the main floor. Patrolman Stuart Katzman was struck on the head by a bottle and was treated for cuts. Sergeant Charles Goodenough suffered a strained back while he was forced against the balcony rail while trying to keep the crowd from pushing close to see what was going on the main floor. Two men, Luis Castro Gonzalez, 21 years old, of 966 Simpson Street in the Bronx, and Julio Rivera, 18, of 213 Burham Street in Brooklyn, were arrested. Both were booked for disorderly conduct at the 16th Street Precinct House, 345 West 47th Street. Many of the Garden policemen and others who had attended 3 previous professional wrestling programs at the Garden this fall had expressed the opinion that a riot was certain at some point to occur. At other programs, chairs and bottles have been thrown. However, up to last night, these were isolated incidents and never precipitated anything like a riot. Yeah, now I know why they take the caps off of my sodas whenever I get something at the Garden, cause holy shit! This was a story that got immediate coverage, not just from the New York Times, where we pulled that article from, or Newsday, or even the Daily News, where there is an article listed in the show notes, but thanks to the Associated Press, the story and the ensuing aftermath were in papers from across the country, as illustrated again in our show notes and links, which are in the description of the episode. Not only that, but it was covered by Life magazine. That's right, one of the most well-read and well-respected publications in the country, if not the world. But it also highlighted something that we talk about a lot as wrestling fans over the last 30 years or so. Death of Kayfabe. In 1957! They were calling it a work in 1957! Hell, they were calling it that earlier than this with Dan Parker's articles on the subject. Again, another thing we've covered in earlier episodes in this series about secret wrestling history. But let's take a look at that Life article, and then we're going to hear directly from the man himself, Dr. Jerry Graham, thanks to the 605 Super Podcast, and a conversation that was recorded by former cohort of the late great Johnny Fabulous alongside Dr. Jerry Graham, Vandal Drummond, aka Lucky Pierre, aka Kurt Brown. Wrestling script gone awry. Unusual efforts bring bloodshed and a riot. Something truly remarkable occurred in Madison Square Garden last week. For a few fleeting seconds, professional wrestling turned honest, and as the picture above shows, the entertainers actually tried to hurt each other. The effect on the audience was so electrifying that they went into a state of riot, and it took 67 cops to stop it. The cause of this moment of truth was the last bout on the card, a quote-unquote tag match between 2 wrestling teams, Antonino Rocca and Edouard Carpentier versus Dr. Jerry Graham and Dick the Bruiser Afflis. In a tag match, only one member of each team is allowed in the ring at a time. The other stands outside the rope. When the man in the ring grows weary or troubled, he gets his partner to take his place by tagging him. It is widely acknowledged that professional wrestling is the most dependable of all sports, since it's pure and conscientious fakery and never double-crosses its fans with a dull, genuine exhibition. Last week's tag match was supposed to follow the off-played script, the triumph of the heroes over the villains. Rocca and Carpentier, who were cast as the heroes, won the first fall despite the despicable fouls, gouges, and groin kicks of the villains. They were battling hard for the second fall when hero Rocca got villain Afflis in a backbreaker hold, slinging him across his back at shoulder level and preparing to hurl him to disaster he so richly deserved. At this point, co-villain Graham, who had previously played his role to the hilt by kicking the heroes in the stomach, broke the rules once more by charging into the ring and pummeling Rocca. Referee Danny Bartfield promptly called a foul on the villains. After all, it was 10:55 and New York has an 11 p.m. curfew on wrestling. The match was awarded to the heroes. Bartfield also tried to get the villains away from the heroes. For following the noble old traditions, they were playing their parts to the end, still attacking Rocca. Then the unthinkable happened. Rocca discovered a red fluid on his face, and it did not come from the pellet of carmine that wrestlers conceal in their mouth so they can simulate bleeding. This was real blood. What was worse, it was his own blood. Rocca lost his temper and the crowd roared. He seized Graham and began bashing his head against the ring post. This also produced real blood. Garden police tried to come to Graham's aid, but they could not cope with the mastodons. Up to this point, the audience of 13,000 had been lively, throwing paper cups into the ring, but not abnormally demonstrative. Now, stimulated by what was probably the first honest competition they'd ever seen, some hundreds surged forward towards the ring. The sprightly sound of chairs being broken up for use as weapons mingled with the splat of half-eaten fruit and the crash of bottles thrown down from the gallery. A cry of "Get the Bruiser!" went up and Atlas paled. Understandably, after all, as a professional wrestler, he is not accustomed to violence. The first fan to penetrate the middle of the ring was a man somewhat incongruously equipped for combat. He was wearing an army jacket and brandished a furled umbrella. Another fan broke a chair and thus obtained a sharp pointed stick. Bearing this lance, he charged. Meanwhile, hero Rocca continued massaging the ring post with Graham's head. The garden was a pandemonium. A dozen scuffles and fights took place in the jammed aisles as some spectators tried to move to the exits and others sought to get to the ring. Bruiser Atlas, the main target of the crowd's wrath, had resolved to fight to the last fan. As customers charged toward him, the short steps or crawled through the ropes, he methodically picked them up and threw them out of the ring like a farmer digging potatoes. The continuous crash of thrown chairs, parts, and bottles was then accompanied by the thud of bodies hitting the press row. Rocca finally tired of bashing Graham's head, and the two behemoths turned to watch Atlas with professional interest. After a moment, they began to help throw back customers. Finally, the city police arrived to help the special police and the 101 ushers and ticket takers who had pitched in to help. The law was also aided by Rocca, who climbed down from the ring to address his admirers in vehement Spanish. At last, the police were able to escort the wrestlers to their dressing rooms. For the wrestlers, the chief casualty of the evening was Graham's $500 purple robe encrusted with sequins. During the melee, someone had stolen it, sequins and all. The garden counted up the other damage, 2 city policemen hurt and 300 chairs damaged. How many customers may have suffered damage was not clear. 3 were jailed or fined. But apparently none was seriously hurt, wrestling fans being able to take anything. 3 days later, after all concerned were brought before State Athletic Commissioner Julius Helfand, who spoke reprovingly to them and fined the wrestlers a total of $2,600. Rocca and Graham drew the heaviest fines of $1,000 each, but Rocca, who makes a reported $100,000 a year wrestling 5 or 6 nights a week, took this with unprofessional sportsmanship. "I am sorry about the whole thing," he said. "Commissioner Helfand is a great American." Herbert Breen for Life magazine, December 2nd, 1957.
What would you say during your career, what would you call the highlight of your career?
The highlight of my career undoubtedly was the Riot, Madison Square Garden. I knew the timing was right. The Puerto Ricanos, the Puerto Rican people, had never seen blood on Antonino Rocca, and I hit him in the eye and split his eye, and they went insane. And of course he retaliated, he run my head into the post, and blood was flowing like water. We had an old-time jubilee right there in Madison Square Garden. My partner was Dick the Bruiser. He was picking up Puerto Ricanos, throwing Puerto Ricans out of the ring like a farmer picking potatoes, and we carried out, the Puerto Ricans carried out 8 of New York's finest police. They had to move in on cavalry and club the Puerto Ricans down, and that undoubtedly was the biggest thing of my career experience. I was fined $2,000 or $3,000 for exciting a riot, but it was the first time they ever saw blood on the Latin Argentina. Rocca was dead.
Isn't Dick the Bruiser still suspended in the state of New York as a result of it?
That's right. Dick the Bruiser is still suspended and will never get back in the state of New York because of that, what happened in Madison Square Garden. I paid my fine, and I am still back in the state of New York and New Jersey.
Let's talk about parasocial relationships for a minute, because now more than ever, the concept of tribalism or parasocial relationships between humans and the characters on a TV show or people who act in any type of media is in the conversation, especially on social media. Wrestling is a perfect platform to stoke these kind of emotional fires because it is an industry that is built on emotional manipulation. The babyface's job is to establish and maintain a connection with the audience, a lot of which is predicated on generating sympathy and acting as an avatar of justice to and for the audience, much like Rocca was here. The heel's job is to do the opposite and generate genuine disdain and the desire for said heel to get their shit wrecked by the valiant babyface/protagonist. So now it's social media furthering the blur of that line between artist and art, and everyone on social media, especially those who have watched a genre or a show for an extensive period of time, believing that they're an expert on the subject and or immediately coming to a conclusion based on nothing more than an emotional connection to the subject. The concept of a riot in wrestling has moved from the stands to the apps. Wrestling fans exhibiting that type of emotion at a show may seem gauche, as the notion of it being quote-unquote real now more than ever isn't true, and they're deathly afraid of being called a mark. Despite clearly in the history books and an article we just talked about, people knew wrestling was a work nearly a century ago. Yet those same fans take to Twitter and Blue Sky, or Truth Social, to spout off their opinions with the same passion, fervor, and cognitive dissonance that these fans displayed just 69 years ago. Nice. Same goes for YouTubers too. There are far too many people who exist on platforms like this that mistake being a fan with being an expert. It's a hard lesson to learn because those people often find themselves within the machinations of part of the industry. Shit, you could consider me a part of that class for the first years of my professional life in both wrestling and radio. You could probably call me a mark now. I wouldn't be that offended by it. I make professional wrestling videos about 1957 riots on YouTube. I'm a bit of a mark. And much like Jerry Graham, they exist to be the antagonist and derive attention and financial gain from the act of getting heat. But unlike Jerry, these Jerrys, creators, tend to find themselves being the ones worked and not the ones doing the working, especially in New York City. As mentioned in the life piece, the end result of the story was $2,600 in fines, which, adjusted to 2026, equaled over 30 grand. And while the Riot card may not have been the definitive draw that McMahon would have wanted, to draw over 30,000 fans to MSG in a month and be covered by not only Life magazine, but the New York Times, the Associated Press, and across the gamut of media in 1957 is pretty damn impressive. While their return in December would just be above 9,000 fans for a $24,000 house during the Christmas season, the 1958 season inside the Garden would witness 11 cards, only one of them dipping below 10,000 fans with an average audience of 16,866 fans. McMahon, in just under 2 years, had redefined wrestling not just on television, but in the arenas, all without a true NWA or world champion headlining the cards, as Thez would not appear on MSG cards in this era, and Carpentier wasn't champion when he was on these cards. And neither would Pat O'Connor later in the decade, though O'Connor, a former Capitol mainstay, would defend his world title throughout 1959. It would be in places like the Sunnyside Gardens against Lenny Luca Brasi Montana, the Bronx's Puerto Rico Theater against Tokyo Joe, and twice against Duke Hoffman at the Asbury Convention Hall and in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It wouldn't be until Buddy Rogers became Capitol's centerpiece that the NWA World title, or any world title to be honest with you, would play any central role to the plans for their concern. If you want to hear about that, you're in luck because we have a video, several videos, about that right here on this channel. Have suggestions for anything we're doing? Want more one-shots like this? Miss when I put out weekly looks at secret wrestling history? Well, I do too. Let me know in the comments. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And no, I've missed you all terribly. This has been Historically Speaking.